The vast Wyoming sky, a boundless sheet of pale blue, stretched endlessly over the Rollins ranch. Below it, the land rolled in waves of sun-bleached grass and dark earth, a kingdom of quiet and space broken only by the distant, shifting dots of cattle. At the heart of this kingdom stood the ranch house, a sturdy structure of weathered timber and stone that spoke more of solidity than comfort. It was a place built to withstand blizzards and drought, but the chill that had taken root within its walls was of a different, more persistent kind. Inside, the silence was a heavy thing. It lay thick in the parlor, undisturbed by the crackle of a fire that wasn't lit, and it echoed in the grand, empty dining room where a single place setting of tarnished silver gathered dust. This was the domain of Jake Rollins, a man who owned everything the eye could see from the front porch, and yet possessed nothing that truly mattered. His footsteps, the hard heel of his boots on the polished wood floor, were the only regular sound, a lonely metronome marking the passage of solitary days. He stood at the window, a broad-shouldered figure etched against the light, his face a landscape of its own, all sharp angles and a stern set to his jaw. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, watched his hands at work in the far pasture, but his mind was miles and years away, lost in the ghost of a memory where the silence was once filled with laughter, with the gentle murmur of a woman's voice, with the gurgling coo of an infant. The loss had carved him out, leaving a hollow man in a hollow house. A horse approached the house, its gait weary. Jake's gaze sharpened, focusing on the rider. It was Thomas, his foreman, and the closest thing he had left to a friend. Thomas dismounted with a grunt, his own face lined with a concern he rarely voiced. He found Jake in the parlor, still staring out at nothing. "The men got the fence line mended down in the south quarter," Thomas reported, his voice too loud for the quiet room. Jake merely nodded. Thomas shifted his weight, clearing his throat. "House is getting mighty dusty, Jake. A place this size, it's too much for one man. You need a girl. Someone to cook, clean, air the place out." Jake's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't want strangers in this house, Thomas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't need the noise." "It ain't about noise," Thomas persisted gently. "It's about life. This place feels like a tomb. Has for years." He didn't say the rest, didn't mention the name of the woman whose presence still haunted the halls, or the tiny room upstairs that had remained locked since the day he'd carried a tiny, still cradle out of it. He just waited, letting the weight of his words settle. Before Jake could form another refusal, a movement at the end of the long driveway caught both men's attention. A figure was walking toward the house, a small carpet bag in one hand, the other shielding eyes from the relentless sun. As the figure drew closer, they could see it was a young woman, her dress simple and travel-worn, her posture slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller. She stopped a respectful distance from the porch, her eyes fixed on the ground. Thomas tipped his hat. "Can we help you, miss?" Her voice, when it came, was so soft they had to strain to hear it. I was told there might be work here. For a maid." She finally glanced up, and Jake saw her eyes were a warm shade of brown, wide with a nervousness that seemed to go bone deep. She looked from Thomas to Jake, and her gaze immediately dropped again under the intensity of his stare. Jake felt the familiar irritation rise. An intrusion. A complication. This shy, fragile-looking thing would be useless on a ranch. She'd probably jump at her own shadow. He opened his mouth to send her away, to tell her there was no work, to retreat back into his silent, familiar grief. But as he looked at her, he saw the fine layer of dust on her worn shoes, the weary slope of her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly where they clutched her bag. He saw not just shyness, but a fear that mirrored his own in a different, quieter way. The refusal died on his lips. A strange, reluctant pity stirred in his chest, a feeling so foreign he hardly recognized it. He let out a short, tired breath. "The pay is fair. Room is above the kitchen. You do your work, you stay out of my way." The words were rough, offering no welcome, only a transaction. He didn't wait for her response. He turned on his heel, his boots echoing once more through the silent house, leaving the shy young woman named Sydney Bennett standing on his porch, a single, small promise of change in the vast, empty Wyoming landscape. The following days settled into a new, even quieter rhythm within the Rollins house. Sydney Bennett moved through the grand, somber rooms like a whisper, a ghost of efficiency who left gleaming surfaces and the faint, clean scent of soap in her wake. She learned the geography of silence, mapping the floorboards that groaned underfoot and avoiding them with an instinctive grace. Her world became the swish of a dusting rag, the soft scrape of a broom, and the methodical polish of silver that had long forgotten its luster. She worked with her head down, her movements economical and precise, as if she wished to leave no trace of herself behind. Jake Rollins became a storm cloud passing through his own home, a presence felt more than seen. He would come in from the range, the scent of leather, horse, and cold air clinging to him, and find his dinner kept warm on the stove. He would find his favorite chair by the massive stone fireplace free of dust, the hearth swept clean of old ashes. He would leave his muddy boots by the door and find them returned hours later, cleaned and placed neatly against the wall. It was all done so seamlessly, so utterly without fuss or expectation, that it began to feel less like a service and more like a quiet, natural law of the household. He found himself, against his will, noticing things. He noticed the way she hummed, a barely audible little tune, when she thought she was truly alone in the kitchen. He noticed the surprising gentleness with which she treated his old, temperamental ranch dog, Scratch, who had taken to following her on her rounds, his tail giving a soft thump against the floorboards whenever she passed. Most of all, he noticed the absence of fear in her eyes when she looked at the dog, a stark contrast to the nervousness she displayed around men around him. One afternoon, a deep exhaustion born from a sleepless night and the weight of perpetual grief settled over Jake. He had sunk into his worn leather armchair by the cold fireplace, intending only to rest his eyes for a moment. The sun, slanting through the window, painted a warm rectangle on the floorboards, and the silence of the house, usually so oppressive, felt strangely peaceful. His breathing deepened, his rigid posture softened, and he slipped not into sleep, but into a still, wakeful doze, his mind hovering at the edge of consciousness. It was in this state that he heard the nearly soundless pad of footsteps approaching. He recognized the light, careful tread.
Sydney.
He remained perfectly still, curious and oddly unwilling to break the spell of the moment by revealing he was awake. He felt her presence hover near him, a warmth in the cool
room.
He could smell the faint, simple fragrance of her soap. He expected her to turn and leave, but she did not. Instead, there was a soft, rustling sound. Then, the gentle, almost imperceptible weight of a wool blanket being laid over him. Her hands, small and careful, tucked the edges around his shoulders with a tenderness that was so startling it stole the breath from his lungs. It was a gesture of pure, unasked-for kindness, a simple human comfort he had not experienced since a time he could barely allow himself to remember. The care in that action, the quiet empathy it conveyed, was a language his lonely heart had forgotten how to speak but understood perfectly. He risked opening his eyes the merest slit. She was standing over him, not looking at his face, but studying the blanket she had just arranged, her expression unguarded. In her warm brown eyes, there was no pity, no calculation, only a soft, sincere concern that seemed to radiate from her very core. For a single, heart-stopping moment, she was not his shy maid, but simply a good soul tending to another. Then, as if feeling his gaze, she drew back quickly, her habitual shyness returning in a flush that crept up her neck. She turned and fled the room as silently as she had entered, leaving Jake alone in the sudden, profound warmth of the blanket and the shocking echo of her kindness. The hollow quiet of the house now felt different, no longer empty, but waiting. The blanket, a simple woven thing, became an unspoken monument in the quiet parlor. It remained draped over the back of Jake's chair, a tangible reminder of the kindness that had pierced his solitude. Where before Sydney's presence had been a faint, barely registered whisper in the periphery of his life, she now occupied a distinct and increasingly intriguing space in his awareness. The wall of gruff indifference he had so carefully maintained began to develop hairline fractures, not from any grand gesture, but from the accumulation of small, quiet truths he found himself observing. He began to make a point of being in the kitchen when she was preparing his morning coffee, not for the coffee itself, but to catch the tail end of that soft, absent-minded humming before she noticed him and fell into a flustered silence. He started leaving his books on the side table in the parlor instead of returning them to the shelf, curious to see if she would dust around them with the same careful reverence she showed everything else. She did, often pausing to gently trace the embossed titles on the spines with a fingertip, a look of wistful longing on her face that spoke of a world of stories she felt was closed to her. One afternoon, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he did not immediately retreat to his study after his meal. Instead, he stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching as Sydney prepared to go out to the henhouse. She picked up the basket and then, after a moment's hesitation, selected a few withered apples from the pantry, tucking them into her apron pocket. Curiosity piqued, Jake followed at a distance, keeping to the shadow of the barn. He saw her approach the corral fence where his old, ill-tempered stallion, Midnight, was penned. The horse usually pinned his ears and snorted at anyone who came near, but he watched Sydney approach with a wary curiosity. She didn't try to touch him. She simply stood by the fence, speaking to him in that low, melodic voice he had only heard in hums. Then she produced one of the apples, holding it flat on her palm. Midnight ambled over, sniffed the air, and with a gentleness Jake had never seen in the beast, lipped the apple from her hand. She spent a long moment there, just standing with the horse, a picture of quiet communion between two creatures who understood each other's wariness. Jake felt a strange, tight feeling in his chest, something akin to awe. The true test of this fragile new understanding came on a day when a sudden, ferocious windstorm whipped down from the mountains. It rattled the windows and howled around the eaves of the house. Jake was in the barn, helping Thomas secure the doors, when a tremendous crash echoed from the main yard. A loose section of corral fencing had been torn free by the gale and sent skittering across the hard-packed earth before slamming into the side of the tool shed. The sound was explosive, a violent crack of splintering wood that cut through the wind's roar. Jake and Thomas turned toward the noise, but Jake's eyes were drawn to the back door of the house, which had flown open. Sydney stood there, frozen in the doorway. But it was not the scene of minor damage that held her. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her hands were clamped over her ears, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring at some horror only she could witness. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand. Without a second thought, Jake strode toward her, leaving Thomas to deal with the fence. He moved quickly but not hurriedly, his approach deliberate and calm. "Sydney," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the wind. She didn't seem to hear him, lost in the prison of her panic. He stopped a few feet from her, not touching her, not crowding her. "Sydney," he said again more firmly, "it's just the wind. It's over. It was just the fence." Slowly, her eyes focused on him, though the terror in them remained. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "It's all right," he continued, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of her fear. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you here." He repeated the words, a simple, solid promise. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't tell her to stop being foolish. He simply stood his ground, a solid, unmovable presence between her and whatever ghosts the sound had summoned. Gradually, the violent trembling subsided. Her hands lowered from her ears. The blind panic in her eyes receded, replaced by a dazed embarrassment and a vulnerability that made his chest ache. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw not a servant looking at her employer, but one wounded soul recognizing the protective strength in another. Without a word, she gave him a tiny, shaky nod, then turned and fled back into the house. Jake stood for a long time in the whipping wind, the echo of her fear and the faint, lingering trust in that nod settling something deep within him. The walls around his heart didn't just have cracks. A whole section had quietly crumbled away. The storm, both outside and within, had passed, leaving behind a changed atmosphere in the Rollins household. The air, once heavy with separate silences, now seemed to hold a new, tentative understanding. The incident at the doorway had forged a fragile bridge between Jake and Sydney, built not on words, but on a shared moment of vulnerability and protection. Jake no longer merely observed her from a distance. He began to consciously create moments of proximity, finding reasons to be in the same room, his gruffness softening into a quieter, more thoughtful presence. He took to eating his supper at the large kitchen table instead of alone in the grand dining room, the clatter of his plate a solitary sound in the warm, lamplit space where she moved quietly, wiping counters and sweeping the floor. He began leaving books out on the kitchen table after he'd finished them, a volume of poetry, a history of the territory, a well-loved novel. He never said anything, but he noticed that the next day, the book would always be precisely where he left it, though the page corners were sometimes slightly softened, as if carefully turned by a gentle hand. This delicate new equilibrium was shattered one afternoon by the arrival of Jedediah Blackwood. His approach was announced by the arrogant rhythm of his horse's trot and the cloud of dust that followed him up the drive. Blackwood was a man carved from envy and ambition, his ranch bordering Jake's, his eyes constantly measuring Jake's land, his cattle, his success, with a covetous hunger. He dismounted with a flourish, his gaze sweeping over the impeccably maintained yard and house with a look that was anything but complimentary. Jake met him on the porch, his posture instinctively defensive. "Blackwood," he greeted, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "Can a neighbor pay a friendly call, Rollins?" Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. His eyes, however, were already darting past Jake, into the house. It was then that Sydney emerged from the side door, carrying a basket of laundry to hang on the line. She kept her eyes down, but her presence was a magnet for Blackwood's attention. He watched her walk across the yard, a slow, unpleasant smirk spreading across his face. "I see you've finally got some help around here," Blackwood remarked, his tone dripping with insinuation. "And such quiet help. Very convenient for a lonely man in a big, empty house. Must be a comfort to have such a gentle creature warming your evenings." The suggestion in his words was ugly, a deliberate attempt to soil something clean and simple. He was not just making an observation, he was planting a seed of scandal, knowing how quickly such gossip could take root and spread like a weed in a small territory. Jake's entire body went rigid. The calm he had cultivated over the past weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, swift fury that burned in his veins. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his size suddenly imposing, his face a mask of controlled rage. "You will keep your foul mouth shut, Blackwood," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a hammer strike. "You will not speak of her. You will not even look at her. That woman is under my protection. She is a decent, hard-working person, and your filthy insinuations are not welcome on my land. Now get on your horse, and get off my property. If I see you near this house again, if I hear so much as a whisper of your lies in town, the trouble we have will be more than you can handle." The violence in Jake's tone was unmistakable. Blackwood's smirk vanished, replaced by a startled, then furious, expression. He had expected annoyance, perhaps a gruff dismissal, not this fierce, unequivocal defense. He mounted his horse without another word, shooting a last, venomous glance at the house before riding away, the dust cloud behind him angry and thick. Jake stood on the porch, his hands clenched into fists, watching until Blackwood was a speck on the horizon. When he turned, he found Sydney standing just inside the screen door, her basket forgotten at her feet. She had heard every word. Her face was pale, but her eyes, wide and shimmering, were fixed on him. In them was not fear, but a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had not just given her a job, He had defended her honor without a moment's hesitation, shielding her from a malice she knew all too well. That evening, as the sunset painted the kitchen in shades of orange and gold, Sydney did not retreat to her room after finishing her work. She stood before Jake, her hands twisted in her apron. "Mr. Rollins." "Jake, thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion.
"For what you said to that man."
He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the strength it took for her to stand there. "You don't have to thank me for that," he said, his voice gentle. No one should have to hear such things. The dam of her silence, built from years of fear, finally broke. In a rush of soft, hesitant words, she trusted him with a piece of her truth. She spoke of a past back east, of a domineering uncle who had seen her as unpaid labor, of a home that had been a prison of demands and sharp words, of a final, desperate decision to run away with little more than the clothes on her back. She did not share all the details, but the shadow of it was there in her eyes. When she finished, the kitchen was silent save for the pop of the fire in the stove. Jake did not offer empty pity. Instead, he offered a piece of his own soul in return. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, her laughter that used to fill the halls. He spoke of his infant son, Samuel, and the cruel fever that had taken them both in a single, devastating week. He spoke of the years of silence that had followed, of the hollow man he had become. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not even Thomas, not in such a raw, unvarnished way. They stood there in the dim light, two shattered people, their deepest pains laid bare between them. But instead of adding to the weight of the silence, the shared confessions seemed to lighten it. The space that separated them was no longer filled with the unknown, but with a hard-won, mutual understanding. The bridge between them was no longer fragile. It was built on the solid stone of shared loss and a protective bond that had, in the face of Blackwood's cruelty, revealed its true depth. The shared confessions in the firelit kitchen had irrevocably altered the landscape of their relationship. The house, once a museum of solitary grief, now hummed with a new, unspoken energy. Jake and Sydney moved around each other with a heightened awareness, a silent communication passing between them where words were no longer necessary. He would find a fresh pot of coffee waiting for him exactly when he needed it most. She would discover a beautiful, leather-bound journal left on her bedside table, a silent encouragement for the love of stories he had seen in her. The ranch hands, led by the observant Thomas, noticed the change in their boss. The grim set of his jaw had softened, and he sometimes even paused to look at the sunrise instead of just charging through the day. This newfound peace, however, was a fragile island in a hostile sea. Jedediah Blackwood, fuming from his humiliating dismissal, was not a man to accept defeat. The outright confrontation had failed, so he turned to a weapon far more insidious and difficult to fight: gossip. He began making trips to the nearby town of Silver Creek, holding court in the saloon and the general store. His words were carefully chosen, dripping with false concern and sly implication. He spoke of the lonely, wealthy rancher and the young, pretty live-in maid he'd taken in. He wondered aloud about the peculiar closeness he'd witnessed, painting a picture not of innocence, but of impropriety, of a vulnerable girl and a man taking advantage of his position. The poison worked its way through the small community swiftly. Whispers followed Thomas when he went to collect supplies. The women at the general store, who had once smiled shyly at the handsome rancher, now looked away with pinched, disapproving faces. The unspoken accusations hung in the air, a stain on Sydney's character and Jake's honor, designed to isolate them and make Sydney's life unbearable. Thomas, his face grim, finally brought the news to Jake as he was mending a saddle in the barn. "There's talk, Jake," he said, his voice low. "Ugly talk. Blackwood's been spinning lies in town. They're calling her. Well, they're saying things no decent woman should have said about her." Jake's hands stilled on the leather strap. The cold fury he'd felt on the porch returned, but it was sharper, more focused now. This was an attack he couldn't fight with his fists or a shouted command. This was a battle for reputation, for the right to simply live in peace. He found Sydney in the garden, carefully weeding around the fledgling vegetable plants. The afternoon sun caught the strands of hair that had escaped her bun, framing her face in a soft light. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, and her smile, which had become less rare, faltered at the look on his face. He didn't shield her from it. He told her plainly what Blackwood was doing, his voice tight with a controlled rage. "He's trying to run you off," Jake finished, his hands clenched at his sides. "He thinks he can smear your name until you have no choice but to leave. But I won't let him. I give you my word, Sydney. I will fix this." He expected fear, or tears, or the resigned shame of someone who is used to being maligned. But instead, he saw a different emotion flicker in her warm brown eyes, a spark of defiance. The vulnerability was still there, but it was now armored with a fierce trust in the man standing before her. She believed his promise. She rose from her knees, brushing the dirt from her hands, and took a step toward him. The space between them, once a cautious distance, now felt like a magnetic field, pulling them together. The protection he offered, the fury he displayed on her behalf, had stripped away the last of her reservations. She reached out, not with haste, but with a profound certainty, and her small, work-roughened hand found his large, calloused one. Her fingers laced through his, a silent answer to the cruelty of the outside world. The contact was electric, a jolt that went straight to Jake's core. He looked down at their joined hands, then into her eyes, and saw no shyness, only a clear, unwavering trust and something else, something warmer and far more dangerous. He gently squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture of breathtaking tenderness. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he lowered his head. Sydney rose onto her toes to meet him halfway. The kiss was not one of passion, but of promise. It was gentle and searching, a silent vow spoken against her lips, a vow of protection, of defiance, and of a feeling too vast and new to be named. It was the sealing of their alliance, not just against a common enemy, but for a shared future. When they finally parted, the world outside, with all its rumors and malice, seemed to fade into a distant, insignificant hum. The only thing that was real was the connection thrumming between them in the quiet of the sun-drenched garden. The kiss in the garden hung between them like a sacred vow, a silent pact that transformed the very air they breathed. In the days that followed, a new and profound tenderness wove itself into the fabric of their interactions. A lingering touch as Jake handed Sydney a cup of coffee, a soft, secret smile exchanged across the room. The way her hand would rest on his arm for a fleeting moment, these small, electric gestures built a private world within the walls of the ranch house, a world immune to the ugly rumors Blackwood sought to spread. They were careful. This new love of theirs was too fragile and precious to be flaunted, but it was there, a steady, glowing ember in the hearth of Jake's once cold home. Yet, Blackwood's malice was not so easily dismissed. Having failed to drive them apart with words, he resolved to use force. His envy festered into a cold, calculating plan to cripple Jake's operation and terrify the woman he now saw as the key to Jake's newfound strength. He gathered a few of his most disreputable hands, men motivated by coin rather than conscience, and under the cover of a moonless night, they rode toward the Rollins ranch with mischief burning in their hearts. Their target was the large hay barn on the outskirts of the main yard. The plan was simple, a small, controlled fire. Enough to cause panic, draw all the hands away from the house, and signal that Jake Rollins was not untouchable. As they approached, one of the men, a brutish fellow with more courage than sense, lit a torch and flung it into a loose pile of dry hay stacked against the barn's outer wall. The flames caught instantly, licking hungrily at the weathered wood, casting monstrous, dancing shadows across the yard. The shout of "fire" went up almost immediately from a night watchman. Within moments, the ranch erupted into controlled chaos. Jake, bolting from the house where he had been reading by the lamp, took charge with a fierce calm, barking orders to form a bucket line from the well. Every cowboy, including Thomas, scrambled to contain the blaze, their figures silhouetted against the growing orange glow. The air filled with the shouts of men, the crackle of flames, and the terrified whinnies of horses from the nearby corral. It was the perfect distraction. While all attention was fixed on the barn, Jedediah Blackwood himself, a dark smirk on his face, slipped from his horse and crept toward the main house. His intention was not theft, but violation. He would confront the maid, scare her witless, and make it clear that nowhere was safe for her, that her protector could not, in fact, protect her. He believed the house would be empty, save for one frightened woman. But Jake Rollins, who had learned to think like a strategist through years of managing land and livestock, had anticipated such underhanded tactics. Amid the frenzy of organizing the firefight, he had pulled Thomas aside, his voice a low, urgent command. "The house," he had said, his eyes hard. "Blackwood will use this. Get to the house. Don't let her out of your sight." Thomas had nodded, understanding instantly, and had melted away from the bucket line, a shadow moving with purpose toward the darkened porch. As Blackwood pushed open the kitchen door, he found not a cowering maid, but the steady, unwavering barrel of Thomas's rifle pointed at his chest. Thomas stood solidly between the intruder and the hallway that led to the rest of the house, where Sydney stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth. "The sheriff's been sent for, Blackwood," Thomas said, his voice cold and even. "I suggest you explain to him what business you have breaking into a man's home in the dead of night." Blackwood's smirk vanished, replaced by a sputtering, furious disbelief. His plan had unraveled completely. Outside, the concerted efforts of Jake and his men had contained the fire to the barn's outer wall, the danger already passing. It was at that moment that Jake, his face smudged with soot and his shirt soaked with well water, burst through the same door. His eyes swept the scene, Thomas holding Blackwood at bay, Sydney safe, but shaken in the hallway. The relief that flooded him was immediately eclipsed by a primal, roaring fury. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his focus entirely on the man who had threatened his home, his livelihood, and the woman he loved. He didn't throw a punch. He simply grabbed Blackwood by the collar, his strength immense, and slammed him back against the doorframe with a force that shook the entire wall. "You think you can touch what's mine?" Jake growled, the words a low, venomous promise inches from Blackwood's face. The raw, unchecked power in his voice and his grip made the older man go limp with shock and fear. He said nothing, his scheme utterly defeated. It was then that Jake's eyes found Sydney. The fury drained from his expression, replaced by a desperate, overwhelming need for reassurance. He released Blackwood, letting Thomas keep the rifle trained on him, and strode to Sydney. He didn't care about the soot on his hands or the smell of smoke on his clothes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, his face buried in her hair. He held her as if he were anchoring himself to the only solid thing in the world, his entire body trembling not with fear, but with the aftershock of how close he had come to losing the precious piece she had brought him. In that embrace, surrounded by the lingering scent of smoke and the captured villain, their silent pact was sealed in the fire of adversity. He had protected her, and in her safe return to his arms, she had saved him all over again. The aftermath of the fire and Blackwood's capture settled over the Rollins ranch like a cleansing rain. With the sheriff summoned and the would-be arsonist hauled away to face the consequences of his jealousy and malice, the last lingering shadow that had hung over the property seemed to dissipate into the wide Wyoming sky. The rumors in town, starved of their source and faced with the undeniable truth of Blackwood's criminal actions, withered and died, their poison neutralized. The ranch hands, who had always respected Jake, now looked upon him with a renewed, fierce loyalty, seeing the lengths he would go to protect his own. And in the center of it all was Sydney, no longer the shy, spectral maid, but the quiet, steady heart of the home everyone now openly acknowledged her to be. The following weeks were a time of deep, quiet healing. The physical scar on the land, the blackened patch by the barn, was quickly repaired, new wood standing pale against the old. The emotional scars, too, continued to mend, soothed by the balm of shared purpose and open affection. There were no more pretenses, no more carefully maintained distances. Jake's love for Sydney was as solid and undeniable as the earth beneath their feet, evident in every glance, every gentle touch, every time he said her name. And her love for him was her anchor, giving her a courage she never knew she possessed, transforming her shyness into a serene strength. One evening, as the sun began its magnificent descent, painting the clouds in brilliant shades of rose and gold, Jake led Sydney out to the highest point on the ranch, a gentle rise that looked out over the endless rolling pastures, the meandering creek, and the distant, purple-hazed mountains. The air was cool and still, filled with the scent of sage and earth. He took both of her hands in his work-roughened thumbs stroking her knuckles, and looked into her eyes, which reflected the dazzling sunset. "Sydney," he began, his voice, once used only for giving orders, now soft with a reverence reserved for sacred things. "This land, it was just dirt and cattle to me for the longest time. A monument to what I'd lost. A place to work until I was too tired to remember. But you brought the sun back. You made me remember what it was to feel warmth, to hope, to love." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want you to be my maid. I want you to be my partner, my wife. I want to build a life with you here, to fill this house with the future we choose together. Will you stay with me? Forever?" Tears welled in Sydney's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unshadowed joy. There was no hesitation, no flicker of the old fear. The man before her had fought for her, protected her, and cherished her, teaching her what true safety felt like. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of her entire heart. "Yes, Jake. Forever." He swept her into his arms then, spinning her gently as the last of the sun's rays bathed them in golden light. Their laughter mingled on the evening breeze, a sound of pure, triumphant happiness that seemed to settle into the very soil of the ranch, blessing it for all the days to come. The story of Jake Rollins, the wealthy rancher with a broken heart, and Sydney Bennett, the shy maid with a painful past, was over. In its place began a new story, one of love rebuilt, of a second chance fiercely won, and of a quiet, enduring happiness that would echo through the generations in the sturdy Wyoming ranch house that was finally, truly a home. If you were moved by Jake and Sydney's journey of second chances and found love in the rugged Wyoming wilderness, there are countless more tales waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories of redemption, unexpected romance, and the enduring power of love that heals even the most broken of hearts. A new adventure is always just around the corner.